Life as a medieval assassin was not sleek, efficient, or particularly impressive. It was mostly slow, uncomfortable, and full of long periods where absolutely nothing happened, followed by one short moment where everything went wrong. To begin with, medieval assassins did not live in shadows because it was mysterious. They lived in shadows because rent was cheaper there, the rooms were smaller, and nobody asked questions if you came home bleeding a little. Most assassins were not part of grand secret orders. They were freelancers, political tools, or desperate men with a knife, and very few other skills. Their training was inconsistent, usually informal, and often ended the moment someone decided you were good enough and sent you out to fail quietly. Daily life involved a lot of waiting. Waiting in alleys, waiting near gates, waiting outside inns while pretending to be a normal person, which was harder than it sounds when you haven't bathed properly in weeks. Hours could pass with nothing but cold stone walls, stiff joints, and the constant fear that someone had already noticed you standing there for far too long. Assassins spent more time standing still than running, and more time hiding than killing. Food was a problem. Assassins needed to travel light, which meant little food, poor food, or stolen food. Hunger was constant. A hungry assassin was not a deadly professional. He was tired, shaky, and prone to mistakes. Medieval medicine offered no help for malnutrition, fatigue, or stress, which assassins experienced in generous quantities. Weapons were not specialized tools of elegance. Knives dulled quickly. Poisons were unreliable, slow, and just as dangerous to the user as the target. Crossbows were bulky and loud. Swords were impractical in close spaces. Most killings, when they happened at all, were messy, awkward, and far from guaranteed. Missing once could mean being tackled, stabbed, or torn apart by whoever happened to be nearby. There was also the problem of clothing. Medieval disguises were limited. You could dress as a monk, a merchant, or a servant, but so could everyone else. If you wore something expensive, you stood out. If you wore something cheap, guards watched you more closely. There was no perfect option, only slightly less dangerous ones. Health was another quiet enemy. A small cut could turn fatal. Infections were common. There were no antibiotics, no clean bandages, and no doctors willing to treat someone who arrived injured under suspicious circumstances. An assassin who survived a mission could still die days later from a wound that looked insignificant at the time. Sleep, when it happened, was poor. Beds were hard, inns were noisy, safe houses were rarely safe. Assassins slept lightly, if at all, constantly alert for footsteps, whispers, or the sound of a door opening at the wrong time. Long-term exhaustion was normal, and clear thinking became difficult. Failure had consequences. If you were caught, execution was rarely quick or merciful. Torture was common, especially if powerful people wanted names. If you succeeded, you were still not safe. Employers sometimes decided it was simpler if you disappeared afterward. Witnesses remembered faces. Rumors spread. Perhaps the worst part was how unremarkable it all was. Medieval assassination was not glamorous. It was repetitive, anxious, physically uncomfortable, and often pointless. Many assassins died without anyone knowing who they were or why they existed at all. In the end, being a medieval assassin mostly meant living quietly, being afraid often, and hoping your luck lasted just a little longer than it usually did. Luck, unfortunately, was not something medieval assassins could rely on for very long. Luck ran out quickly. In a world where streets were narrow, people were suspicious, and news traveled faster than you might expect, mostly through gossip shouted across marketplaces. Movement through cities was exhausting. Medieval towns were cramped, uneven, and permanently muddy. There were no clean escape routes, no clear maps, and no predictable crowds. An assassin fleeing a scene might turn a corner and find a dead end, a locked gate, or a group of people who had suddenly decided to ask questions. Horses were loud and noticeable. Running drew attention. Walking calmly after committing murder required a level of confidence most people did not possess, especially when their heart was trying to escape their chest. Communication was another problem. There were no secure messages. Instructions arrived late, vague, or incorrect. Targets moved, died naturally, or were replaced without warning. An assassin could wait weeks for a man who had already left the city or been quietly buried somewhere else. At that point, you either abandoned the job and lost your payment, or improvised and risked killing the wrong person, which tended to end badly. Payment itself was unreliable. Coin was heavy and easy to steal. Promises were lighter and easier to break. Some assassins were paid in advance and vanished immediately, which made future employers more suspicious. Others were paid afterward and never saw the money at all. There were no contracts worth enforcing, and no court willing to hear complaints from someone whose profession involved murder. Trust was scarce. You trusted no one fully, not innkeepers, not messengers, not fellow assassins. Working in pairs reduced some risks but doubled others. Betrayal was common, sometimes encouraged by authorities offering lighter punishment or quick rewards. A whispered name could undo months of careful anonymity. Religion did not help much. Medieval society was deeply religious, which meant assassins lived with constant moral pressure. Confession was complicated when your sins were ongoing. Some tried to justify their work as service to a higher cause. Others simply stopped thinking about it. Neither approach worked particularly well at night, when sleep was thin and thoughts were loud. Weather was also uncooperative. Rain turned roads into traps. Snow slowed movement and left tracks. Heat spoiled food and weakened already tired bodies. There was no ideal season for murder, only seasons with different inconveniences. Age caught up quickly. This was not a career with longevity. Reflexes slowed, knees failed, eyes struggled in low light. Younger men replaced older ones with little ceremony. If you survived long enough to grow old, it was usually because you stopped taking dangerous jobs, which meant you stopped earning money as well. Retirement was vague at best. There were no pensions for assassins, no quiet countryside homes guaranteed at the end. Some tried to blend into normal trades, guards, porters, laborers, but old habits and old enemies had a way of resurfacing. A familiar face, seen by the wrong person, could end everything years later. In the end, medieval assassination was less about skill and more about endurance. Endurance of hunger, endurance of fear, endurance of long stretches of nothing followed by sudden chaos. Most did not last. Those who did were rarely proud of it. So if you ever find yourself romanticizing the idea of a medieval assassin, silent rooftops, precise blades, dramatic escapes, remember that the reality was mostly cold stone, empty pockets, poor sleep, and the constant understanding that tomorrow might not arrive at all. And even when tomorrow did arrive, it usually brought very little improvement. Another morning of stiffness, sore joints, and the quiet realization that you were still alive, which in this line of work was never guaranteed and rarely comforting. Social isolation was constant. Assassins could not afford friendships. Talking too much created patterns, and patterns were dangerous. Familiar faces became liabilities. Even regular visits to the same market stall or tavern could attract attention over time. Many assassins deliberately rotated locations, which meant never feeling settled anywhere. You existed briefly in places, then erased yourself before anyone remembered your name. This constant movement wore people down. There was no sense of belonging, no community to fall back on when things went wrong. If you were injured, sick, or simply exhausted, there was no one you could trust to help without asking questions. Mercy was rare, and favors always came with expectations. Information gathering was slow and unreliable. There were no dossiers, no photographs, no schedules pinned neatly to walls. You relied on rumors, bribes, and observation. This meant long hours pretending to be idle while quietly memorizing routines when someone left their home, who they spoke to, which door they preferred. All of this could change without notice. One unexpected visitor, one delayed meal, one random decision to stay inside could cancel weeks of preparation, and preparation did not guarantee success. Targets were rarely alone. Servants, guards, family members, and neighbors existed inconveniently close together. Walls were thin, floors creaked, doors stuck. A single sound in the wrong moment could unravel everything. Medieval buildings were not designed for silent movement. They were designed to keep warmth in and strangers out, which made quiet entry an exhausting negotiation with wood, iron, and stone. Mental strain accumulated quietly. Living under constant threat sharpened awareness but dulled joy. Assassins became cautious to the point of paranoia. Every sound carried meaning. Every stranger felt dangerous. This constant vigilance made relaxation nearly impossible. Even safe moments felt temporary, fragile, and undeserved. There was also the uncomfortable truth that many assassins were not particularly skilled. Some were competent, a few were exceptional, but most were average men pushed into extreme circumstances. Mistakes were common. Improvisation was frequent. Success was often a matter of luck rather than mastery, which made survival feel arbitrary and deeply unfair. Authority was another looming presence. Medieval law enforcement was inconsistent but ruthless when effective. Punishments were public and theatrical. Being made an example was not just about justice, but deterrence. Executions were meant to be seen, remembered, and feared. An assassin caught in the wrong place at the wrong time could end up displayed as a warning to others, their story reduced to a brief announcement shouted to a crowd. And yet, despite all of this, the work continued. Politics demanded it. Power depended on it. Assassins were expendable tools in larger games they barely understood. They removed individuals, but rarely changed systems. Another rival always appeared. Another order always followed. The world remained largely the same. Perhaps that is the most exhausting part of all, the realization that after all the discomfort, danger, and fear, very little actually changed. No songs were written for you. No monument stood in your honor. Your success, if acknowledged at all, was quietly absorbed and forgotten. So, when people imagine medieval assassins as shadowy legends moving effortlessly through history, it is worth remembering how ordinary and fragile their lives really were. They were cold, tired, underpaid, and constantly replaceable. Their existence was defined less by drama and more by endurance. In the end, being a medieval assassin was not about power or mystery. It was about surviving one more night, hoping not to be recognized, and accepting that if you vanished tomorrow, the world would continue without noticing at all. And with that thought, it is probably safe to let the candle burn low, the streets grow quiet, and history do what it does best, fade gently into the dark. Even the dark, eventually, became familiar. Not comforting, exactly, but predictable in its own dull way. An assassin learned to read shadows the way farmers read weather, noticing small changes that suggested danger long before anything actually happened. Night work sounded dramatic, but it was mostly inconvenient. Streets were darker, yes, but also quieter, which meant every sound mattered. Footsteps echoed. A dropped object felt impossibly loud. Dogs noticed things humans missed and had an irritating habit of announcing it. Moonlight helped with visibility, but ruined concealment. Total darkness made movement slow and clumsy. There was never a perfect balance. Travel between towns was worse. Roads were unsafe, poorly maintained, and full of people who asked questions. Bandits were common, and they did not care about your profession. An assassin robbed on the road, lost weapons, money, and sometimes their reason for traveling at all. Inns along the way offered beds that were uncomfortable and rumors that were usually wrong. Language and customs changed quickly from place to place. Accents gave people away. Clothing styles shifted subtly. An outsider could be identified in moments, which made blending in exhausting. You learned to speak less, listen more, and accept that silence was safer than cleverness. Emotionally, detachment became a survival skill. You could not afford hesitation, but you also could not afford reflection. Thinking too much about consequences made hands unsteady. Thinking too little made mistakes more likely. Most assassins existed in a narrow emotional range, alert, tired, and quietly resigned. Despite popular imagination, many never actually killed anyone. Jobs fell through, targets disappeared, circumstances changed. Some assassins spent entire careers preparing for violence that never happened, which might sound fortunate, but it still carried all the stress without the resolution. Fear without release lingers longer than fear fulfilled. Those who did kill rarely spoke about it afterward. There was no satisfaction, only relief that it was over. Relief, quickly followed by the need to leave. Staying nearby invited suspicion. Witnesses remembered faces better than you hoped. Time blurred. Days were measured by hunger and fatigue rather than calendars. Years passed unnoticed. You aged without milestones. No celebrations marked progress. Survival itself became the only metric that mattered. Eventually, many simply stopped. Not dramatically, not officially. They missed a job, declined another, took work that required fewer risks. They faded into other roles: watchmen, laborers, hired guards, jobs that were still dangerous, just slightly less fatal. Some married, some drank. Some were recognized years later by someone who remembered them just well enough. History, of course, remembered almost none of this. What remains are exaggerated tales, sharpened into legend. Real lives, full of discomfort and anxiety, rarely make for neat stories. Quiet suffering leaves little evidence behind. So, when we talk about medieval assassins, it is worth lowering expectations. They were not shadows with purpose. They were people with limited options, navigating a harsh world with tools that barely worked and luck that eventually ran out. And if that sounds tiring, that is because it was. Now, as the city settles and the candle burns down to a stubborn wick, it is probably time to rest. The assassin has moved on, the streets are empty, and history, as always, is perfectly content to forget. For those who lingered long enough to notice it, the passing of time brought a strange numbness. Fear never fully disappeared, but it softened around the edges, like a sound you hear so often that it becomes part of the background. This was not courage, it was fatigue learning how to function. By this stage, many assassins no longer thought of themselves as assassins at all. It was simply what they did, in the same way a baker baked or a porter carried. The difference was that a baker could grow old in one place, while an assassin remained permanently temporary. Nothing was owned for long. Even names were borrowed, used briefly, and abandoned without sentiment. Money, when it arrived, was spent quickly. Hoarding was dangerous. Carrying visible wealth attracted attention, and hidden wealth invited theft. There were no banks that asked no questions. Coin under a floorboard was only safe until someone else lifted the board. As a result, most lived with little more than they needed, not by philosophy, but by necessity. Physical decline was unavoidable. Joints stiffened from cold nights and long hours of stillness. Eyes struggled in low light. Hands shook from hunger or age. There was no training to compensate for this, no graceful transition into less demanding work. When the body failed, the work simply stopped working. Some tried to pass on knowledge, not formal training, just quiet advice offered to someone younger and clearly desperate enough to listen. These lessons were rarely inspiring. They focused on what not to do, where not to stand, who not to trust, when to leave before things felt wrong. Survival was taught as avoidance, not mastery. Violence, when it occurred, left marks that never fully faded. Even those who avoided injury carried memories that returned at inconvenient times. A sound, a smell, a certain angle of light. Medieval people did not have language for trauma, but they understood its effects. Sleeplessness, irritability, sudden anger, long silences. There was also the slow realization that the world did not notice your efforts. Kings rose and fell. Lords gained power and lost it again. The removal of one person rarely altered the direction of events. The assassin's role was precise but small, like a stitch in a garment no one would ever examine closely. Faith, for some, returned late in life. Not dramatically, quietly. A candle lit in a side chapel. A prayer whispered without explanation. Forgiveness was hoped for, not expected. Others avoided religion entirely, finding the questions it raised too exhausting to answer after everything else. Old age, if reached, was lonely. Former contacts were gone, employers forgotten, enemies unresolved. The world moved on with alarming efficiency. Those who survived long enough often found themselves invisible, which was ironic, considering how much effort had once gone into being unseen. Death, when it came, was rarely notable. Illness, infection, an accident, occasionally, recognition at the wrong moment. There were no dramatic final confrontations, no last words preserved for history. Just a body, dealt with quickly, and a life folded neatly out of record. And perhaps that is the most accurate ending for a medieval assassin. Not a legend, not a cautionary tale, but a quiet conclusion that matched the rest of the experience. No applause, no remembrance, just absence. So, when the idea of medieval assassination drifts through the mind-sharp blades, dark cloaks, decisive moments, it helps to remember the long hours in between, the waiting, the cold, the hunger, the uncertainty, the fact that most of it was endured rather than chosen. With that thought, the story can finally be set aside. The streets are empty now, the work is over, the details blur, as they always do. And history, patient and indifferent, allows another ordinary life to dissolve quietly into sleep. Eventually, even memory began to thin. Details softened first the exact faces, the precise streets, until only impressions remained. Cold nights, long waits, the feeling of listening more than speaking. For many former assassins, this forgetting was not a failure of mind, but a relief. Remembering too clearly served no purpose once the work was done. What replaced it was routine, simple, repetitive days that felt strange precisely because they were predictable. Waking without urgency, eating without looking over one's shoulder, sleeping through the night without rehearsing escape routes in the dark. These were small luxuries, and they took time to trust. More than one former assassin woke suddenly, convinced they had missed something important, only to realize there was nothing left to miss. Yet normal life never fully fit. Crowds felt overwhelming. Loud voices triggered unease. Authority figures, guards, officials, anyone with power, were instinctively avoided. Old habits lingered quietly. Sitting with one's back to a wall, choosing seats near exits, memorizing rooms without meaning to. These behaviors drew little attention, but they marked someone who had lived too long on alert. Work, when found, was practical rather than fulfilling. Manual labor suited those who preferred silence. Guarding warehouses or caravans felt familiar, though less lethal. Some turned to craftsmanship, simple trades, where patience mattered more than precision. None of it paid particularly well, but it paid regularly, which felt unusual and faintly suspicious. Relationships were cautious. Trust came slowly, if at all. Former assassins were good listeners but poor storytellers. They deflected questions gently, answered vaguely, and learned how to appear uninteresting. Being forgettable had once been a skill. It remained one. In rare moments of honesty, some admitted they felt lighter after leaving the work behind. Not happier, exactly, but less tense. The constant pressure had lifted, leaving behind a quiet emptiness that was easier to manage than fear. Others felt the opposite, restless, unanchored, unsure who they were, without danger, defining their days. Peace, it turned out, was something you had to learn. History, meanwhile, continued to misremember them. Stories grew cleaner over time. Assassins became symbols, agents of fate, instruments of justice or chaos, rather than exhausted individuals trying to survive another week. The discomfort, the waiting, the uncertainty were edited out. What remained were sharp moments without context. This was not accidental. Simple stories are easier to repeat. A lone figure in the dark is more compelling than a man shivering in an alley for hours, hoping his target might eventually appear. Drama sells better than endurance. History has always preferred conclusions to processes. If any lesson survived from the real experience, it was an understanding of fragility. How easily plans collapsed, how quickly bodies failed, how thin the line was between being unnoticed and being remembered for all the wrong reasons. This awareness stayed with people long after the knives were gone and the disguises discarded. In quiet moments, some wondered what would have happened if circumstances had been different, if there had been other options, if someone had offered stability earlier, or safety, or simply time. These questions rarely led anywhere useful. The past, like most medieval streets, had no clear way back. And so life went on, smaller and quieter. Days stacked gently on top of one another. Seasons changed, faces aged, names faded from use. The world did not pause to reflect on what had been done in its service. It rarely does, which may be the most honest ending available. Medieval assassins were not meant to be remembered. Their success depended on invisibility, and invisibility is difficult to preserve in history. What remains instead is an outline, a suggestion of lives spent in tension, resolved not with triumph, but with disappearance. So as the final candle shortens and the city settles into sleep, there is nothing left to conclude. No revelation waiting at the end, just the quiet understanding that some lives pass almost entirely between the lines, doing work that changes little and costs much. And if this story feels uneventful, slow, or oddly draining, then it has probably been told correctly. At some point, even the outline began to blur. The edges of the story softened until there was very little left to hold on to, which suited the subject perfectly. Medieval assassins were never meant to leave sharp impressions. Sharp impressions were noticed, remembered, and eventually investigated. What remained instead was a mood, a general sense of weariness that clung to everything, a familiarity with discomfort that never quite faded, even in safer years. Former assassins often described feeling slightly out of step with ordinary life, as though everyone else had been given instructions they somehow missed. Conversations moved too quickly, jokes landed too lightly, worries seemed either trivial or overwhelming, with little in between. Silence, however, felt natural, long stretches of it, the kind that stretches out in the early morning or late evening, when the world pauses briefly and nothing demands attention. This was a silence they understood. Not the tense silence of waiting for footsteps, but the quieter version that asked nothing at all. Many learned to prefer it. Objects took on a certain weight, not sentimental value, exactly, but usefulness. A good cloak mattered. A sturdy pair of boots mattered. Things that endured were appreciated more than things that impressed. Decorative items, loud colors, and unnecessary luxuries felt oddly uncomfortable, like drawing attention for no reason. Memory played tricks. Some moments remained unusually clear. An alley lit by a single torch, the sound of rain on wood, the feeling of cold stone through thin fabric, while entire years disappeared into a vague blur. This was not unusual for people who had lived under constant stress. The mind, like the body, learned to conserve energy by letting go of what it could. When illness came, as it eventually did, it was faced with the same quiet acceptance as everything else. Medieval life did not encourage optimism about recovery. Pain was endured. Weakness was hidden. Complaints were kept minimal. Drawing attention while vulnerable had never been a good idea. If death arrived gently, it was considered fortunate. Many simply failed to wake one morning. Others faded over weeks, attended by no one in particular. There were no final confessions, no dramatic revelations. The past remained unspoken, largely because there was no one left who needed to hear it. Records, if they existed at all, were brief and inaccurate. A name, possibly wrong. An age, guessed. A cause of death, approximate. The rest dissolved into the general background of medieval existence, where countless lives passed without comment. Centuries later, historians would attempt to reconstruct these figures from fragments: a reference in a court document, a rumor preserved in a chronicle, a suspicious death mentioned in passing. From this, entire myths would grow. Secret orders, elaborate rituals, grand strategies. It was all very tidy and almost entirely incorrect. The truth was less exciting, but more human. Medieval assassins were shaped by necessity rather than ideology. They adapted, endured, and eventually disappeared, leaving behind little more than a faint disturbance in the flow of events. If they succeeded too well, no one noticed. If they failed, they were erased quickly and publicly. This imbalance is perhaps why the legends persist. Mystery fills gaps better than exhaustion ever could. Stories prefer intention over accident, drama over routine. But routine was the true core of the experience. Routine fear, routine discomfort, routine uncertainty about whether tomorrow would require running, hiding, or simply waiting again. If there is any comfort to be found in this, it is the reminder that history is not made only by its loudest moments. It is also shaped by quiet endurance, by people whose names were never recorded, but whose lives followed patterns we can still recognize. Fatigue, adaptation, letting go. And so, the medieval assassin fades in the most appropriate way possible, not with a conclusion, but with a gradual loss of detail. The knife is set down, the cloak wears thin, the streets empty. What once felt urgent becomes distant, then irrelevant. The candle has burned low for some time now. The room is dim. The city outside has settled into its uneven sleep. There is nothing left to plan, nothing left to watch for. The story, like the life it describes, ends not with resolution, but with quiet absence, which, for a medieval assassin, was always the goal. By then, even absence began to feel complete. Not empty, but settled, like a room after furniture has been quietly removed and the dust allowed to rest. There was nothing left to anticipate, which was unfamiliar at first and then, gradually, acceptable. For someone who had lived by reacting, listening, watching, waiting, the lack of urgency created an odd stillness. Days passed without meaning to pass. Meals happened because the sun had moved. Sleep arrived without effort. The body, long accustomed to tension, slowly learned that it was no longer required to prepare for flight. This adjustment took time. Rest did not feel earned. Calm felt suspicious. Many former assassins found themselves inventing small routines, not because they were necessary, but because they provided structure. Walking the same path, sitting in the same place, observing without purpose, these habits echoed the old life in safer forms. The world around them continued, indifferent and steady. Markets opened and closed. Bells rang. Seasons changed without consulting anyone. The concerns of ordinary people, weather, prices, minor disputes felt distant at first, then oddly grounding. These were problems that did not require secrecy or speed. They could be addressed slowly, sometimes even postponed. There was relief in being unremarkable, being one face among many, being overlooked not because of careful planning, but because no one was looking closely at all. This was a different kind of invisibility, softer and less exhausting. It did not require effort. It simply happened. Occasionally, fragments returned without warning. A sudden memory of a sound, the feel of rough fabric, the smell of damp stone. These moments passed quickly. They no longer demanded action. They were acknowledged and then allowed to fade, like echoes in an empty corridor. Age softened the edges further. The body slowed. The mind wandered. Reflection replaced vigilance. Regret, when it appeared, was vague and unfocused. There were no clear alternatives to compare against, only the understanding that life had been shaped by circumstance more than choice. It became easier to accept that this was true for most people, not just assassins. Medieval life offered few clean paths. Many ended up where they did not intend to be, doing work they had not planned, surviving in ways that made sense at the time and were questioned only later. History rarely accounts for this. It prefers clear motives and decisive actions. It struggles with drift, compromise, and quiet endurance. Yet these were the forces that defined most lives, including those we now label as dangerous or exceptional. The medieval assassin, stripped of myth, was simply someone who adapted repeatedly until adaptation became routine. That routine left marks, but it also allowed survival in a world that offered little protection to anyone. When the end finally arrived, it was not anticipated. It never is. It came as endings usually do during sleep or illness or an ordinary moment that failed to announce itself. There was no sense of completion, only cessation, and perhaps that is fitting. A life spent avoiding notice concludes without attracting it. No marker, no summary, just the quiet closing of a door that few knew existed. What remains is not a lesson, exactly, more a mood, a reminder that beneath dramatic labels lie ordinary patterns of fatigue, adjustment, and persistence. That many lives move forward without clarity or reward, sustained by habit and circumstance rather than intention. So as this account settles, there is nothing to resolve, no final revelation to uncover. The assassin has long since stepped away, leaving behind no trace worth following. The streets are still, the candle has gone out, the details no longer matter, and history, content with its legends, sleeps on. There is, finally, very little left to say, not because the subject has been exhausted, but because exhaustion itself has become the subject. Everything that needed effort has already taken it. The medieval assassin does not linger at the edge of history, waiting to be rediscovered. He drifts inward, dissolving into the background of ordinary medieval life, where most people lived and died without comment. He becomes indistinguishable from the many others who learned to endure quietly, to adapt without complaint, and to accept that recognition was neither promised nor useful. What survives is not a story of skill or danger, but of repetition, repeated caution, repeated hunger, repeated nights spent half awake, repeated choices made not because they were good, but because they were available. Over time, repetition smooths everything down. Sharp memories dull, strong emotions flatten, even fear loses its edge. In this way, the assassin's life becomes almost peaceful at the end, not because it was resolved, but because it no longer resists. There is nothing left to hide from, no role left to perform. The tension that once defined each hour loosens its grip, replaced by a quiet neutrality. This neutrality is easy to misunderstand. It looks like emptiness from the outside. In reality, it is simply the absence of urgency. For someone who once measured time in heartbeats and footsteps, this absence feels strangely full. The world, meanwhile, continues doing what it always has. Power shifts, names change, conflicts repeat themselves with minor variations. Whatever small part the assassin once played is absorbed without ceremony. Causes advance or collapse for reasons far larger than one person moving through the dark. Centuries later, someone may still wonder what it was like. They may imagine tension, drama, and decisive moments. They may picture mastery where there was mostly improvisation, and purpose where there was often just survival. This misunderstanding is harmless. It changes nothing now. The truth, as always, is quieter. Life as a medieval assassin was not a sharp line through history. It was a faint smudge, barely visible, easily overlooked, and ultimately irrelevant to the larger picture. And that, more than anything else, explains why it ended the way it did. Not with triumph, not with failure, just with stopping. The candle does not flare before going out. It shortens, dims, and disappears without sound. The room grows darker, but nothing important is lost. What needed light has already been seen, and so we let it rest there. No more watching, no more waiting, no more imagining what comes next. History is quiet now. You can be too. After that stopping, there is only continuation of a different kind. Not the kind marked by danger or intent, but the kind that happens automatically, without asking permission. Breathing continues. Days arrive, nights follow. Life persists in small, nearly invisible motions. For someone shaped by constant readiness, this kind of continuation feels unreal at first. There is no signal to respond to, no pressure narrowing the world into immediate decisions. The mind, once trained to scan endlessly, drifts instead. Thoughts come and go without urgency. Silence stretches longer than expected and remains unbroken. This silence is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It settles slowly, like dust in an unused room. At first it feels uncomfortable, as though something has been forgotten. Then it becomes familiar. Then it becomes preferable. Former assassins often found themselves awake early, long after there was any reason to be. Old habits kept them alert before dawn, listening to a world that no longer required attention. Birds replaced footsteps. Wind replaced whispers. Nothing followed. Over time, even this vigilance faded. Muscles softened. Posture relaxed. The body learned new patterns, slower ones. Pain remained, but it was predictable, dull, manageable. There were no sudden spikes of fear to sharpen it. The idea of legacy never took hold. There was nothing to pass down, no lessons that felt worth formalizing. Survival techniques were irrelevant in ordinary life. Silence did not need explanation. Avoidance was no longer a skill, just a preference. If asked who they were, answers stayed simple. Names, trades, places. No embellishment, no curiosity, invited. This simplicity was not a disguise, it was the absence of one. Memory continued its quiet erosion. Events lost sequence, causes blurred into outcomes. What had once felt critical now seemed oddly distant, as though it had happened to someone else. This distance was not denial, it was perspective arriving late. Occasionally, the past surfaced without context, a sudden tension in the shoulders, a moment of alertness triggered by nothing obvious. These reactions passed quickly. There was no longer a need to obey them. The medieval world did not offer reflection as a luxury. Most people lived forward, not backward. When thought returned to earlier years, it did so without narrative. There was no arc to follow, no lesson to extract. Just a series of adaptations made in response to circumstances that no longer existed. This lack of meaning might sound bleak. It rarely felt that way. Meaning requires effort, interpretation, and expectation. Letting go of it simplified things. Days did not need to signify anything. They only needed to pass. Death, when it finally arrived, did not interrupt anything important. It closed what had already been closing. There were no loose ends waiting to be tied. No story paused mid-sentence. Just a life ending in the same understated way it had been lived for some time. The world adjusted immediately. Someone else occupied the space. Work continued. Weather changed. This was not cruelty. It was consistency. Medieval life did not pause often, and it did not pause here. If this feels anticlimactic, that is accurate. The idea of climax belongs to stories, not to most lives. Medieval assassins were not structured for endings. They were structured for disappearance, and so that is how it remains. Not as a warning, not as a legend, just as an example of how many lives move through history without shaping it, and how much effort it takes simply to endure. Nothing more needs to be added. The details have thinned to the point where adding them would be dishonest. What mattered has already been said, quietly and at length. The room is still. The night is ordinary. History has stopped paying attention, which means, finally, that you can stop paying attention too. At that point, attention itself becomes unnecessary. Not something to guard, not something to manage. It simply loosens and drifts away, like a breath you forget you were holding. For most of a medieval assassin's life, attention had been a burden. Too much of it meant danger. Too little of it meant failure. Everything depended on adjusting its weight carefully, moment by moment. When that pressure finally disappeared, the absence felt strangely light, as if something essential had been misplaced and then quietly forgiven. Days no longer required strategy. There was no need to consider angles, timings, or exits. Decisions were small and reversible. Eat now or later. Walk or sit. Speak or remain silent. None of these choices carried consequences worth calculating. This simplicity was not exciting, but it was deeply unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things take time to feel safe. The medieval world offered few explanations for this transition. There was no language for after. Lives were expected to continue until they didn't, without commentary. People rarely discussed who they had been before. Identity was practical, not reflective. You were what you did today, not what you had done once. As a result, the assassin's former life did not demand closure. It did not return for resolution. It simply stopped being relevant. The past settled into the same category as childhood illnesses or long journeys, things that had happened, shaped the body in quiet ways, and then receded. Occasionally, others noticed something slightly off, a calm where tension might be expected, a hesitation before entering crowded spaces, a preference for edges over centers. These traits were unremarkable enough to pass without comment. Medieval life produced many cautious people for many reasons. Silence remained the most comfortable companion, not the silence of secrecy, but the silence of no longer needing to explain. Conversations could be brief, answers could be incomplete. There was no urgency to fill gaps. Gaps were useful. They allowed the world to move on without interruption. The seasons continued their slow rotation. Cold returned, warmth followed. The body adjusted without resistance. There was no reason to resent discomfort anymore. It arrived without threat and left without consequence. Pain existed, but it no longer carried instructions. Sleep deepened, dreams thinned. Nights passed without rehearsal or anticipation. Mornings arrived without calculations. The body learned that waking was not a signal. It was simply waking. If this sounds dull, that is because dullness was a privilege. Dullness meant safety. It meant nothing was about to happen. After a life shaped by uncertainty, nothing happening felt like an achievement, even if no one acknowledged it as such. History, of course, did not notice this phase at all. It does not record quiet continuations. It prefers beginnings and endings, not the long stretch in between where people simply exist. The assassin's final years blended seamlessly into this unrecorded majority. Eventually, even the idea of having once been someone else lost its weight. There was no effort made to remember or forget. Both required attention, and attention had already been released. What remained was presence without focus, movement without aim. When the end came, and it always did not interrupt a narrative. There was no sense of being cut short. Life had already been tapering for some time, narrowing gently until stopping felt consistent rather than sudden. No one marked the moment. No one needed to. The space left behind was filled quickly and without significance. Another person stood where one had stood before. Another routine replaced an old one. This was not erasure. It was continuity, doing what it always did. If there is anything to learn here, it is not about assassination, or danger, or medieval politics. It is about how easily extraordinary circumstances dissolve back into ordinary life, and how little ceremony that process requires. Most lives, when stripped of labels, follow this pattern. Intensity fades, urgency diminishes. What remains is a quiet sequence of days that do not ask to be interpreted. They simply pass. And so, this account ends the only way it reasonably can. Not with insight, not with warning, not with meaning neatly arranged, just with time continuing until it doesn't. The room is quiet. The story has already finished. Nothing is waiting to happen. You don't need to stay awake for it. After that, even continuation loses its shape. Time becomes less like a line and more like a soft blur, moving forward without announcing itself. Days are no longer counted. Weeks pass unnoticed. The calendar, if one exists at all, is something other people pay attention to. For someone who once measured life in narrow windows of opportunity, this looseness feels almost unreal. There is no sense of falling behind. There is no sense of arriving anywhere either. Life exists in a steady middle, where nothing presses urgently enough to demand reaction. The body settles into this pace without complaint. Movements slow, not out of weakness, but because speed is no longer useful. Hands no longer hover near imagined threats. Eyes no longer scan rooms automatically. The posture softens, gradually, as though the bones themselves have been waiting for permission to rest. The medieval world remains loud in the distance, markets calling, carts rattling, bells marking hours no one needs, but these sounds no longer carry meaning. They are background, like weather. Heard, acknowledged, ignored. Food tastes simple, not better, not worse. Hunger arrives gently and leaves when addressed. There is no urgency in eating quickly, no fear of interruption. Meals become pauses rather than preparations. If someone speaks, the conversation drifts. Topics are practical: weather, work, small inconveniences. There is no pressure to be interesting. Being forgettable is not a tactic anymore. It is just a state of being. Sometimes, someone might ask a question that brushes close to the past. Where are you from? Have you always lived here? The answers remain vague, not out of caution, but habit. Precision has never felt necessary. The truth is wide enough to walk around without stepping on it. Memory continues to thin, not dramatically, gently, like ink fading from parchment exposed to light. The sharpest moments lose contrast. What once felt decisive now seems oddly interchangeable with other days that followed the same pattern of waiting, watching, and leaving. There is no effort to preserve these memories. Preservation suggests value, and value suggests attachment. Attachment once came with risk. Even now, long after risk has retreated, The instinct to let go remains. Emotion, too, becomes quieter. Not absent, just less demanding. There is no thrill, no dread, no anticipation worth naming. Contentment appears occasionally, unannounced, and disappears the same way. It leaves no obligation behind. The world does not reward this phase. It does not punish it either. It simply accommodates it, the way it accommodates countless other lives unfolding without distinction. Medieval society was well practiced at absorbing people into its background. And so the former assassin blends completely into the general human noise, one figure among many, performing small tasks, occupying small spaces, leaving little trace. This is not redemption. It is not resolution. It is simply what happens when intensity runs out. Eventually, even the idea of having once lived differently loses clarity. The mind no longer frames the present as after. There is only now, stretched thin and even, with no sharp edges left to catch on. When weakness arrives, it does so gradually. Fatigue lingers longer, cold feels heavier, illness takes more time to pass, if it passes at all. There is no drama in this. Bodies wear down. Medieval people expected this. There was no surprise attached to it. Care, when given, is minimal but sufficient. A shared space, a borrowed blanket, a bowl of warm food. No one asks for a story in return. No one waits for significance. This quiet exchange feels appropriate. And then, at some point, without announcement, there is no more adjusting to do. Breathing slows. Awareness narrows. The world recedes without resistance. There is no sense of something being taken away. There is only a gradual absence of sensation. No one marks the exact moment. The body is discovered later, or not at all. The response is practical. Space is cleared. Life continues. This is not neglect. It is simply the rhythm of the time. If history notices anything, it notices nothing. There is no entry worth recording, no detail that demands explanation. The life ends the way it learned to live quietly, without interruption. And that, finally, is the most accurate ending possible. No summary is needed. No meaning is extracted. No warning is issued. The candle has long since gone out. The room has cooled. The story faded some time ago. There is nothing left to follow. You can rest now. What follows that rest is not really part of the story anymore. It is the absence of story asserting itself, quietly and without resistance. The kind of absence that does not feel like loss, because nothing is being held tightly enough to be taken. In medieval life, this was common. Lives ended without punctuation. No conclusions were drawn. No summaries were offered. People simply stopped appearing in the small, repetitive scenes that made up daily existence. Someone else stood in line where they once stood. Someone else slept in the same narrow space. The world adjusted without comment. If the assassin's life had taught anything, it was that attention is temporary. Focus shifts, interest fades, even danger eventually looks elsewhere. This truth, once terrifying, becomes oddly comforting at the end. To be overlooked is no longer a strategy. It is a certainty. The places that once mattered do not remember. Alleys do not recognize footsteps. Walls do not retain secrets. The rooms that once felt tense now feel ordinary to everyone else. Whatever urgency once filled them has drained away, leaving only stone and wood doing what stone and wood have always done. Time passes in layers. New routines settle on top of old ones. New worries replace older fears. The medieval world, busy with its own rhythms, has no capacity to pause and reflect on individual trajectories. It moves forward because it must, not because it intends to. This is why the idea of legacy rarely applies. Legacy requires an audience. Most lives, including this one, had none. They unfolded privately, intersected briefly with others, and then receded. Nothing was owed to them afterward. If there is something gentle in this, it lies in the lack of judgment. The end does not evaluate the beginning. It does not weigh outcomes or assign meaning. It simply arrives, as nights always do, whether or not anything significant happened during the day. The medieval assassin, stripped of myth entirely now, becomes indistinguishable from countless others who lived cautiously and died quietly. The profession dissolves, the label disappears. What remains is only the outline of a human life, shaped by conditions it did not choose and adapted to as best it could. This is not tragedy. Tragedy requires awareness, an audience, and a sense that things could have gone differently. Most medieval lives did not have the luxury of that comparison. They were not measured against alternatives. They were measured only by continuation, and continuation, eventually, ends. By the time it does, there is nothing left to resolve, no tension waiting to be released, no unanswered question demanding closure. The world has already moved past the point where answers would matter. This is why the final moments are so quiet, not because they are peaceful in any romantic sense, but because there is simply no noise left to make. Everything that once demanded attention has already let go. So, the story does not conclude. It dissolves. It thins until it can no longer support detail. Words lose their grip. Description becomes unnecessary. And that is where we leave it. No revelation waiting beyond this point. No hidden truth to uncover. No sharp ending to stay awake for. History has returned to its preferred state. A wide, indifferent calm filled with ordinary lives passing unnoticed. You don't need to follow this any further. Nothing else is going to happen. There is nothing left after that which could reasonably be called an event. What remains is simply the background continuing to exist, uninterrupted and unconcerned with what has faded from it. If you were to look for traces, you would not find much. No marked place, no preserved belongings, no clear point where one life ended and another arrangement began. Medieval environments were efficient at absorbing people. Space was reused. Objects were repurposed. Memory adjusted itself without effort. The habits that once defined survival lose even their echo. Sitting near walls becomes coincidence. Listening carefully becomes preference. Silence becomes ordinary. There is no longer a reason to ask why these patterns remain. They are not protecting anything. They are simply there. Time no longer feels directional. It does not move toward anything. It circulates gently through routines that require little thought. Morning light arrives. Evening darkens. The sequence repeats until it stops mattering how many times it has happened. The body responds by simplifying. Movements become economical. Thoughts shorten. Long explanations feel unnecessary, even internally. There is no urgency to understand or justify. Understanding implies a need to do something with the information. There is nothing left to do. In this phase, even reflection becomes rare. Looking back requires energy, and energy is reserved for basic functions: eating, sleeping, staying warm. These tasks are enough. They do not need context or narrative. If others are nearby, interaction is minimal but functional. A nod, a shared task, a brief exchange of words that does not invite follow-up. This is not isolation. It is efficiency. Medieval life encouraged it. The past no longer feels distant or close. It feels neutral, like weather that has already passed through the area and moved on. There is no expectation that it should return, and no concern that it might. Eventually, the body begins to require more rest than before. Standing takes longer. Cold settles deeper. Illness lingers. None of this is interpreted as decline. It is simply what happens. Medieval people did not frame aging as a problem to be solved. It was an observable process, accepted without commentary. When assistance appears, it is practical. Someone brings food. Someone adjusts a blanket. No one asks for explanations. No one expects gratitude beyond acknowledgement. This exchange does not carry meaning. It carries continuity. At some point, awareness narrows further. Sounds soften. Light fades. The distinction between sleeping and waking loses importance. The body moves toward stillness without resistance. There is no recognition of a final moment. There is only a gradual absence of sensation. Breathing slows. Then it does not resume. This is not noticed immediately. It does not need to be. Later, someone notices. The response is procedural. Space is cleared. The rhythm resumes. Medieval life was practiced at this. Nothing remains unresolved, because nothing is waiting to be resolved. The story did not build toward this. It simply arrived here naturally. If this ending feels indistinct, that is accurate. Distinct endings belong to stories that expect to be remembered. This life was not structured that way. And so there is no final thought to offer, no lesson to underline, no moment to replay. The background continues. The space fills. The absence goes unnoticed. That is all. You can let it fade completely now. By now, even fading has finished its work. There is no gradualness left to describe, no process still unfolding. What once moved toward stillness has already arrived there and stayed. If someone were to look closely, they would see nothing remarkable. Just another space used and then cleared. Another body handled with the same quiet efficiency applied to countless others. No pause long enough to suggest importance. No silence held in recognition. The rhythm does not change. This is not neglect. It is scale. Medieval life operated at a pace where individual detail rarely slowed the whole. People came and went, illness moved through homes, accidents happened. The world learned to absorb loss without hesitation, because hesitation was expensive. What remains afterward is not memory, but adjustment. Someone else sleeps in the same place. Someone else carries on the same work. Objects are reused without sentiment. The outline of daily life closes neatly around the absence, sealing it in without effort. If there were habits left behind, they blend quickly into the background. Everyone is cautious in their own way. Everyone learns where to stand, how to listen, when to speak. Nothing about this stands out. Nothing demands explanation. History does not circle back. It does not double-check. It does not wonder if something important has been missed. It moves forward with a confidence built on repetition. What was unusual yesterday is ordinary today. What was feared once becomes another footnote, then disappears entirely. Centuries later, if someone attempts to reconstruct the past, they may notice a gap, a name that stops appearing, a record that ends abruptly. This gap invites speculation. Perhaps something dramatic happened. Perhaps something meaningful. In most cases, neither is true. The gap exists because lives do not end where stories expect them to. They end wherever continuation runs out. The rest is silence, and silence leaves little evidence behind. This is why so many medieval figures appear briefly and then vanish, not because they were secretive, but because they were ordinary, in a time that did not preserve the ordinary. Paper was scarce. Attention was limited. Survival mattered more than documentation. The medieval assassin fits neatly into this pattern. Once stripped of urgency and myth, there is nothing left that requires explanation. No unresolved conflict waiting to surface. No hidden significance delayed for later discovery. The work did not lead anywhere. It simply stopped being necessary. The body did not transition into something symbolic. It returned to the same stillness as everything else. Even language begins to feel unnecessary at this point. Words imply movement, direction, interpretation. There is none of that left. Only continuity continuing, briefly, and then not. If you find yourself waiting for a final image, there is none. No closing scene, no last look, no moment held just long enough to feel meaningful. The medieval world did not arrange itself that way. Endings happened between tasks, between breaths, between moments no one was paying attention to. That is what this becomes, finally. A life that no longer needs describing because description would add something that was never there. So we stop not because something has concluded, but because there is nothing left that requires keeping awake for. The background has fully reclaimed the space. The details have withdrawn. The tension has long since dissolved. History remains quiet, not out of respect, but because it has already moved on. And that is enough. You can let it go now. At this stage, letting go no longer feels like an action. It feels like the natural state things return to once effort is no longer applied. Nothing resists, nothing pulls back. The idea of holding on seems unnecessary, almost confusing. If there were witnesses, they would not describe anything dramatic. They would say the day was ordinary. The light came through the same opening it always did. The air felt the same. The sounds outside followed their usual patterns. Nothing marked the moment as different until later, and even then only briefly. This is how most medieval lives ended. Not announced, not emphasized, not framed as meaningful. Meaning was not assigned at the end. Meaning, when it existed at all, belonged to survival, not conclusion. For someone who had once lived by timing and caution, this lack of structure might seem ironic. A life once narrowed down to precise moments now spreads out into something shapeless. No deadlines, no signals, no consequences waiting nearby. Just duration, thinning quietly until it disappears. The body, which once demanded constant attention, slowly stops making requests. Hunger fades, pain dulls, awareness narrows, sensation becomes softer, then intermittent. There is no struggle against this. Struggle implies purpose. There is no purpose left to protect. The medieval world offers no commentary on this transition. It does not provide reassurance or reflection. It simply allows it to happen, the way it allows rain to fall or wood to rot. These processes are not emotional. They are expected. Someone eventually notices. Not immediately. There is no reason to check too often. When they do, the response is calm and practical. Tasks are completed. Space is adjusted. The day resumes. This is not indifference. It is efficiency learned over generations. Afterward, there is no lingering presence, no sense that something has been removed. Absence integrates quickly into routine. Life reshapes itself around it without effort. Another body fills another role. Another routine occupies the same hours. If this feels unsettling, it is only because stories often promise more. They promise recognition, reflection, closure. Medieval life rarely delivered these things. It was too busy continuing. Centuries later, historians might try to interpret the quiet. They might assign significance to the lack of information. They might imagine hidden motives or secret endings. These interpretations say more about modern expectations than medieval reality. The reality was simpler and slower. Lives ended the way they were lived, without emphasis, without annotation, without audience. In that sense, the medieval assassin's final disappearance is not unique at all. It is perfectly ordinary. It matches the endings of farmers, laborers, servants, travelers. The label dissolves. The difference disappears. What remains, if anything remains, is only the sense of duration having completed itself. Time, having carried something for a while, sets it down and moves on. No weight is felt. No pause is required. There is nothing left to examine here. No detail hidden just out of view. No insight waiting to be extracted. The process has finished because it no longer needs continuation. So the account does not conclude with a statement. It does not summarize what has been learned. Summaries are for things meant to be remembered. This was never meant to be. Instead, it settles, like dust, like quiet, like a room after everyone has left and the air has stopped moving. The medieval world remains. Stone walls stand. Streets are used. Bells ring. New concerns replace old ones. The past does not linger long enough to ask for acknowledgement. And that is the final condition. Not an ending, but a complete lack of necessity for one. Nothing more follows. The room is still. The time has passed. The story no longer requires attention. You can sleep. By now, even the idea of after has worn thin. Not because time has stopped, but because it no longer arranges itself into anything that resembles a sequence worth tracking. Things simply occur, gently, without insisting on being noticed. If someone were standing nearby, they might struggle to describe what makes this moment different from any other. The light looks the same. The air behaves as expected. Nothing announces itself as final. Medieval endings rarely did. Finality was something recognized later, usually by someone else, usually after the fact. For a life that once depended on anticipation, this absence of anticipation feels almost like relief, disguised as boredom. There is no longer a need to prepare, no advantage to staying alert. The future, whatever shape it has left, does not require defense. The body understands this before the mind does. Muscles loosen, breathing slows, movements become economical, then optional. Effort is reserved only for what is unavoidable. Eventually, even that calculation fades. The body stops asking questions it already knows the answer to. Around this point, the distinction between presence and absence becomes less useful. Awareness drifts, sensations overlap, sound arrives without direction, light fades without meaning. There is no resistance to this narrowing. Resistance belongs to earlier stages, when something was still at stake. The medieval world offers no vocabulary for this moment. It does not call it peaceful. It does not call it tragic. It does not call it anything at all. It simply allows it to happen, the way it allows shadows to lengthen or fires to burn down to embers. Someone will eventually notice, perhaps much later, perhaps sooner than expected. It depends on routine, not concern. When they do, there is no shock, only recognition. This outcome was always possible. It required no explanation. What follows is practical. Tasks are done in a certain order. Space is adjusted. Objects are moved or reused. No one lingers longer than necessary. Medieval life did not encourage lingering. There was always something else that needed attention. Afterward, the rhythm returns almost immediately. Meals are prepared. Work resumes. Weather is discussed. Small inconveniences reclaim their usual importance. The absence settles into the background without friction. If there were any traces left behind, they are subtle enough to be meaningless. A worn threshold, a familiar spot where someone used to sit. These details fade quickly. Memory, when not reinforced, dissolves on its own. Centuries later, nothing remains that could be mistaken for a conclusion. There is no marker, no preserved account, no reliable witness. At best, there might be a brief mention that stops abruptly, leaving modern readers to wonder what happened next. The answer, inconveniently, is nothing special. What happened next is what always happened next. The world continued. Other lives took up space. Other concerns replaced old ones. The pattern held. This is why it is so difficult to reconstruct lives like this with any confidence. The absence of drama is not evidence of secrecy. It is evidence of ordinariness. Most lives were not arranged to be remembered. The medieval assassin, by the end, is no longer distinguishable from anyone else. The title no longer applies. The habits have softened. The risks have passed. The identity dissolves into the general shape of human existence, where labels are temporary and outcomes are unrecorded. If this feels anticlimactic, that is because it is accurate. Climax is a luxury of storytelling. Real lives, especially medieval ones, rarely pause to provide it. And so there is no final insight offered here. No warning delivered at the last moment. No lesson underlined. Those require intention, and intention has long since stepped away. All that remains is a settled quiet. Not silence, exactly, but a low, continuous background hum of life continuing elsewhere. The sound of things not paying attention. This is where the account naturally stops. Not because something has finished, but because nothing else needs to be said. The candle has burned out. The room is dark, but unchanged. Outside, the world continues with or without this story. You don't need to follow it any further. What comes next is not a chapter, but a thinning. The sort of thinning where words themselves begin to feel excessive, like speaking in a room that has already emptied. If you tried to point to a moment where everything finally ended, you would miss it. There is no clean edge, no sound to mark it. Medieval life rarely allowed for such clarity. Things stopped by degrees, and then people noticed later, if at all. For someone who once lived with constant awareness of timing, this lack of definition would have seemed impossible. Every earlier stage depended on knowing when something might happen. Now, nothing depends on that knowledge. Time moves without consulting anyone. It does not speed up. It does not slow down. It simply passes. The body follows along without argument. Breathing becomes shallow and then deeper again, for reasons that no longer matter. Sensations arrive muted, as though filtered through layers of cloth. Cold is noticed, but not resisted. Warmth is accepted without appreciation. There is no evaluation taking place. The medieval world does not step in to interpret this. There is no expectation that someone should feel a certain way at the end. Feelings are not required. They are optional and eventually unnecessary. Life winds down in the same practical manner it wound forward. If anyone is nearby, their presence does not intrude. Voices are heard without urgency. Movement is registered without curiosity. There is no impulse to respond. Response is not demanded. This is not peace in the poetic sense. Peace implies resolution, and resolution implies a problem has been solved. Nothing here is being solved. It is simply concluding in the only way available by losing momentum. At some point, effort becomes redundant. Muscles relax because there is no reason to hold them ready. The mind drifts because there is no task requiring attention. This drifting is not chosen. It happens the way dusk happens, regardless of preference. Later, much later, or perhaps sooner than expected, someone will realize that a presence has become an absence. The recognition is brief. There is no confusion. This outcome fits within what medieval life prepared people to accept. The response follows familiar steps. The body is handled carefully but efficiently. Space is cleared. Objects are redistributed. No one lingers to reflect. Reflection does not keep anyone warm or fed, and medieval societies were practical about these things. Afterward, the environment adjusts almost immediately. Sounds return to their usual pattern. Light falls the same way it did before. The absence is absorbed without friction. This is not cruelty. It is continuity. If any trace remains, it is subtle enough to mean nothing. A slightly worn floorboard. A place where a body once rested longer than others. These details dissolve quickly under repetition. Use erases memory more effectively than time ever could. Centuries later, someone might attempt to imagine this ending. They might add emotion. They might supply meaning. They might assume a final thought, a last awareness, a moment of clarity. There is no evidence for any of that. The medieval assassin's life, by this point, no longer carries the shape of a story. It has returned fully to the general condition most lives occupy: unremarkable, undocumented, and complete without explanation. This is often uncomfortable for modern expectations. We prefer conclusions that tell us something. We look for lessons, arcs, transformations. Medieval reality rarely cooperated. Lives did not exist to instruct. They existed to continue until they didn't. And so nothing more is offered here. No summary, no closing reflection. Anything added now would suggest importance that was never claimed. The candle has been gone for some time. The room has cooled evenly. Outside, other lives continue in their own unrecorded ways. There is no reason to stay alert. No reason to wait for anything else. History is already asleep. At this point, even the idea of continuing feels unnecessary. Not because something dramatic has occurred, but because everything that could move has already settled into place. The medieval world was very good at this. It absorbed endings without ceremony and moved on without reflection. People did not linger over what had stopped. They focused on what still needed doing. Fires had to be kept lit. Food had to be prepared. Weather had to be endured. These concerns were always more urgent than absence. If you imagine the space now, it looks no different than it did before. The same walls, the same uneven floor, the same quiet accumulation of dust in corners no one bothered to clean too often. Nothing in the room announces that something has concluded. Rooms were not designed to remember. Time continues, but gently. Not in chapters or stages, just in repetition. Morning light returns, evening follows. The cycle repeats until it no longer matters how many times it has done so. This repetition is not comforting or unsettling. It simply is. The body, which once required constant negotiation, has stopped asking. There are no signals left to interpret, no discomfort demanding adjustment, no hunger sharp enough to name. Sensation fades without objection. This is not surrender. It is completion without commentary. In medieval life, this was considered normal. There was no expectation of awareness at the end, no belief that something important had to be experienced or understood in those final moments. The end did not need witnesses. It did not need acknowledgement. Someone else, somewhere nearby, eventually notices the stillness lasting longer than usual. The recognition arrives quietly. There is no rush. This has happened before. It will happen again. The response follows familiar motions learned over generations. Afterward, the day resumes. That is the most accurate detail to hold on to. The day resumes. This resumption is not cruel. It is not dismissive. It is practical. Medieval societies survived by continuing. Pausing for too long invited problems that could not be afforded. Grief, when it existed, was folded into routine rather than placed above it. Objects left behind are redistributed. Nothing is kept for sentimental reasons. Sentiment is a luxury that requires time and stability. What remains is used. What cannot be used is discarded. The space becomes functional again almost immediately. If a trace lingers, it does so briefly. A memory of where something used to be. A momentary hesitation before realizing it no longer matters. These impressions dissolve quickly under repetition. Use smooths over absence faster than time alone. Centuries later, there is nothing here to reconstruct. No clear endpoint to analyze. No personal account to quote. At best, there might be a gap in records, a name that no longer appears, a mention that ends without explanation. This gap does not hide a secret. It hides ordinariness. Modern imaginations tend to resist this. We expect conclusions to teach us something. We want a final insight, a closing thought that ties everything together. Medieval life rarely offered such conveniences. It did not arrange itself to be meaningful in retrospect. Meaning, when it existed, belonged to survival, to getting through one more winter, to finding enough food, to avoiding immediate danger. Once those concerns were gone, there was nothing left that required interpretation. The medieval assassin, by this point, is no longer distinct. The role has dissolved, the habits have softened, the risks have passed. What remains is simply a life that reached its natural limit and stopped. There is no judgment attached to this, no evaluation of success or failure. Those categories require perspective, and perspective fades along with urgency. So the account ends not with a statement, but with quiet continuation elsewhere. Other lives move forward. Other routines take shape. The world does not mark the transition because it does not need to. The candle burned out a long time ago. The room has been dark for a while. Nothing important changed because of it. History prefers it this way. Quiet, uninterrupted, asleep. And now, there is truly nothing left to stay awake for.